December the 26th, 1973. Long lines of people wrapped in scarves stood shivering in the biting cold of the New York winter. They lined up around the Cinema Eye Theater complex on 3rd Avenue. Inside the screening room, the atmosphere thickened. As the screen transitioned to the core exorcism scene, ear-piercing screams rang out. The audience began to vomit. Several people fainted right in their seats. Paramedics had to stand by at the emergency exits with smelling salts and stretchers. The press called this the cinematic event of the decade. Critics took their hats off to a masterpiece. Millions believed they were witnessing the pinnacle of makeup artistry and acting technique. But all of that greatness was built on a lie. People praised makeup expert Dick Smith for turning an innocent face into a demon. People honored veteran actress Mercedes McCambridge for swallowing raw eggs and chain-smoking to create that gruff, demonic voice. But there was one sound that did not belong to any special effect. It was the screaming of little Regan McNeil as her body repeatedly bounced and slammed down on the bed. That savage, ear-splitting, and desperate sound was not a brilliant acting performance. It was the physical cry for help of Linda Blair, a child who had just passed her 13th birthday. To film the violently shaking bed scene, the production system did not use optical effects or modern safety measures. They chose the most rudimentary and violent method. Linda Blair was tightly strapped to a mechanical scaffolding system using stiff, coarse belts. This device was designed to violently jerk up into the air and slam down repeatedly. In one sensitive take, the technician failed to correctly calculate the amplitude of oscillation, or, simply, they ignored basic physical principles. The sudden pulling force violently yanked the child's body. The safety harness, instead of keeping her safe, turned into a lever. Linda's body was bent in the wrong posture, violently slamming her lower back against a hard surface. That impact fractured the child's lumbar vertebrae. It was a direct mechanical injury. The body's physiological reflex when suffering spinal trauma is a sudden muscle spasm, followed by a sharp, piercing pain shooting straight to the brain. Linda's scream at that moment was the instinctive survival reaction of a human being who was biologically being torn apart. The little girl cried. The little girl begged for help. But in the director's chair, William Friedkin did not yell, "Cut!" This director, hailed as a genius, saw a child with a broken bone and decided to let the camera keep rolling. The concept of perfectionism in art was used as a smokescreen to legitimize an act of physical abuse right on set. That scream of genuine agony, the manifestation of permanent destruction to a child's body, ultimately made it straight into the theatrical cut. Global audiences paid to watch a brutal workplace accident, believing it was entertainment. There were no safety boundaries. There were no child protection rights. Under the studio lights, the life of a 13-year-old girl was merely a consumable prop, thrown directly into the gears of the entertainment industry machine. To measure the cruelty of this incident, we must look at the numbers. Any crime requires a motive, and the motive of the studio alliance is always money. In the early 1970s, Hollywood was drowning in a crisis. The Warner Brothers conglomerate desperately needed a boost to revive its financial reports. They greenlit the Exorcist project with an initial production budget of about $12 million. When the film concluded its theatrical run, it grossed over $440 million globally. Analyzed from an economic perspective, the return on investment, also known as the ROI index, reached an unimaginable level. Simply put, for every dollar of capital the studio invested, they earned nearly $37 in profit. If inflation is factored in, this is one of the highest-grossing R-rated films of all time. Standing amidst that massive financial earthquake, Warner Brothers faced a PR risk conundrum. How do you sell a movie featuring a child mutilating herself, swearing, and committing blasphemous acts without being targeted by child protection organizations? The capitalist answer was razor-sharp. Turn the victim into a prodigy. A massive, meticulously refined public relations PR campaign was activated. The studio's media machine began molding a perfect illusion. Press releases were scattered across major newsrooms. They described Linda Blair not as an exploited child, but as a brave child actress, a natural talent, someone who had dedicated herself entirely to the seventh art. They arranged cross-country promotional tours for the 14-year-old girl. They pushed her into live interviews on national television broadcasts, demanding she smile and recount cheerful behind-the-scenes stories. The brutal reality was completely concealed. Not a single article mentioned that the little girl's spine had been permanently damaged. No one knew that, hidden beneath the glamorous dresses on the red carpet, Linda Blair was enduring chronic pain from an injury that was never fully treated. This whitewashing strategy reached its zenith when the Hollywood power system awarded this illusion with prestigious accolades. Linda Blair won the Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actress. Immediately following that was an Oscar nomination. Academics and the entertainment press clapped and cheered together. The golden statuettes and titles were not just rewards. They were a tool to legitimize a crime. By draping the child in the cloak of high art, the corporate machine completely neutralized any questions about professional ethics and occupational safety. They drained both the body and the identity of the child, turning her physical pain into a flawless marketing campaign. Millions of viewers bought tickets. Thousands of critics wrote glowing reviews, all unwittingly becoming accomplices in maintaining this dazzling illusion. And while the masterminds were popping champagne to celebrate at lavish Beverly Hills parties, Linda Blair was taking limping steps in the dark, facing her permanently ravaged body all alone. Behind the closed doors of C Studio in Manhattan, a brutal ecosystem was established. To materialize the vision of a demon-possessed room, the production conglomerate disregarded the physiological limits of human beings. They invested tens of thousands of dollars to install a massive industrial refrigeration system right inside the soundstage. The room temperature was consistently maintained at -30 degrees Celsius. The sole purpose was so the camera lens could capture the white breaths emanating from the actors' mouths, creating a realistic visual effect without using expensive CGI. In that artificial ice bunker, camera technicians, lighting experts, and director William Friedkin were all heavily bundled up in thick fleece jackets, wearing insulated gloves and snow boots. And Linda Blair, the 13-year-old girl, was required to wear only a paper-thin cotton nightgown. Every workday dragged on for hours. Linda's tiny body shivered constantly, her lips turned purple, and her fingertips went numb. The horrifying temperature disparity combined with an exhausting filming schedule collapsed the child's immune system. But, within the contract terms tightly drafted by the studio's legal team, there was no document specifying a maximum time enduring extreme temperatures for an underage actor. The corporate machine employed an incredibly sophisticated trick: specialized occupational safety standards. Simply put, they set their own rules on their set, turning systematic physical abuse into mandatory script requirements. The pinnacle of cruelty lay in the mechanical machine that made up Reagan's bed. It was not an ordinary movie prop. It was an industrial machine designed with powerful hydraulic pistons, capable of bouncing, violently twisting, and tossing everything on top of it with immense acceleration. To keep Linda from being thrown to the ground, technicians used a system of cables and rough leather straps tightly cinched around her chest and hips. No stunt double was assigned to perform these risky takes. There was no medical consultation. The industrial gears needed Linda's face in every close-up frame. When the director yelled, "Action!" the hydraulic system violently jerked the bed into the air. The child's body was thrown up, yanked down, and whipped from side to side with an invisible, uncontrollable force. The leather straps cut deep into her flesh. Her ribs, spine, and tender joints had to bear the full kinetic energy of a machine weighing hundreds of kilograms. It was no longer acting. It was mechanical torture repeated dozens of times just to satisfy the thirst for perfect frames of the men in charge. The brutal physical impact on the set eventually led to an irreversible biological disaster. The fracture in Linda Blair's lumbar vertebra did not receive timely medical intervention. Instead of suspending filming and taking the victim to the hospital, the power system simply gave the child painkillers, injected muscle relaxants, and shoved her back onto that possessed bed. They could not let the production schedule stall. Every single day the set closed meant tens of thousands of dollars evaporating from the budget. When The Exorcist swept through theaters and raked in hundreds of millions of dollars, the real storm began to crash down on Linda. The film's blasphemous content and horrific imagery incited a wave of hatred from extremist religious groups. They called the girl the incarnation of Satan. thousands of anonymous letters filled with death threats and chilling parcels were sent directly to the Blair family's private residence. The public's attention was no longer confined to the limits of fandom, but shifted to a lethal fanaticism. Faced with a direct threat to the life of the star they had created, Warner Brothers executed a classic capitalist move: risk management and stop-loss strategy. In layman's terms, they applied a squeeze the lemon and discard the peel policy, thoroughly exploiting the child's image to make money, but immediately shirking responsibility when her safety became a financial burden. During the first 6 months after the film's premiere, the studio hired bodyguards to protect the Blair family 24/7. But as soon as the promotional campaigns ended, the bodyguard contract was abruptly cut. The studio alliance washed their hands completely. They used the excuse that providing personal security was outside the legal obligations of a film production unit. The 14-year-old girl, with a fractured spine and the onset of agonizing sciatica, was thrown straight to the wolves of public opinion and murderers issuing threats. Her family had to constantly move, live in hiding, and pay out of their own pockets to hire local police for protection. Meanwhile, the studio's media machine executed a flawless information blockade campaign. Not a single medical report about Linda's spinal injury was leaked to the outside. Not a single person on the board of directors had to stand in the dock for exploiting and endangering a minor. They swept the scene of the abuse under the guise of a cinematic masterpiece, continuing to sell tickets, sell television rights, and rake in billions of dollars in lifetime profits. The cruelty was executed methodically, silently, and entirely legally, leaving behind a single victim bearing permanent injuries that would never be compensated. Let's fast forward the timeline to the modern era. In 2000, Warner Brothers decided to reopen its vault. They released a restored version to global theaters titled The Exorcist, the version you've never seen. A massive new marketing campaign was relaunched. With just 11 minutes of film restored from old drafts, this entertainment conglomerate effortlessly raked in an additional $40 million. And most recently, in 2021, Universal Pictures spent an unimaginable price, $400 million, just to acquire the franchise rights for a new trilogy. Mountains of money continue to be generated from a franchise that is half a century old. A new generation of audiences continues to line up to buy tickets, and they shudder once again at the screams of little Regan. But time, the only thing that can increase the value of cinematic copyrights, has absolutely no healing effect on a mechanical injury. The fracture in the lumbar vertebrae of 13-year-old Linda Blair never truly closed. Let's look straight at basic medical records. When you shatter a bone structure that acts as a pillar, at an age when the body is still developing, the consequences do not just stop at a few weeks in a cast or a few blister packs of painkillers. That trauma led to chronic scoliosis and permanent disc degeneration. Simply put, with every single step, with every single time she bends down for the rest of Linda's life, her nervous system automatically fires off sharp pain signals. That woman's body was turned into a physical prison, permanently locking away the remnants of a movie. Capitalists might pocket hundreds of millions of dollars from re-releases, selling anniversary Blu-ray discs, and licensing toys. But the person who contributed their blood and bones for them has to pay for lifelong physical therapy bills out of her own pocket. The irony of history reached its peak in 2010. The U.S. Library of Congress officially inducted The Exorcist into the National Film Registry, basically a list of the most sacred and inviolable works of American culture. Director William Friedkin was honored as a living monument. The work was officially canonized for having profound cultural, historical, and aesthetic significance. But there is a naked truth that cinematic academia always refuses to face. The preservation of The Exorcist is not simply the preservation of an artistic masterpiece. From the perspective of an independent investigation, it is the act of framing and glorifying a crime scene of child abuse that they got away with. The legal system of that era provided a perfect cover for this crime. The Coogan Law, enacted decades prior, was inherently designed only to address financial issues, ensuring child stars were not fleeced of their earnings by their own parents. But absolutely there was no practical legal framework to protect their physical safety boundaries against violent demands in the name of the director's art. The top brass in Hollywood understood this massive loophole all too well. They knew that throwing a child onto a hydraulic machine violently jerking her into the air and fracturing her spinal bone would never be charged as intentional infliction of injury. They covered it up under a safe phrase, workplace accident. And in this blood-soaked industry, the life-threatening risks of the actors at the bottom of the system are the most solid stepping stones for the fame of those sitting behind the lens. So, ultimately, what is the true legacy this machine left for Linda Blair? After her commercial exploitation value was squeezed dry, the image of the possessed little girl became a giant shadow that swallowed her entire identity. Major producers refused to cast Linda in roles with depth. The industry quickly tossed her aside, pushing her into a string of cheap B-movie horrors and parody roles mocking her own traumatic past. From a victim of physical exploitation, she was turned into a persistent joke in pop culture. In the end, the only escape Linda found was not under the flashing lights of Hollywood, but in establishing an abandoned animal rescue organization. A brutally symbolic choice. She dedicated the rest of her life to protecting defenseless creatures because in the year she was 13, at her weakest and most vulnerable age, not a single person in that massive system stood up to protect her. More than half a century has passed. The Exorcist still stands firmly at the pinnacle of cinematic history. But it is time for us to shatter that perfect illusion. The next time you see the scene of the bed violently jerking into the air, the next time you hear the heart-wrenching scream echoing from the chest of a 13-year-old girl, remember that there is no supernatural demon possessing Regan McNeil. The real demon had always been sitting behind the monitor, holding a script, sipping hot coffee, and nonchalantly ordering a mechanical system to crush a child's spine. That movie was never a fictional horror piece. It is the most authentic documentary footage recording the process of draining a life, labeled as art, and sold to global audiences for hundreds of millions of dollars.